Hey, everybody. We're back after a 5-week break. Of course, we had banked a number of terrific shows so we could air new ones each week. And thanks for listening. These were what we call evergreen shows. We had Brian Fogel about the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi, who's the producer of The Dissident. We had Adam Serwer of the Atlantic Monthly on his book, The Cruelty is the Point, which makes a very convincing case that Trump, Steve Miller et al. Were trying to tell certain people, immigrants say, that we're going to make your life so miserable. We're going to separate immigrants from their children and do nothing to keep track of them so that we can traumatize families. And that will discourage these people they didn't want from making the trip in the first place. And that was something the Trump people did, not in spite of the fact that it was cruel. Being cruel was the added benefit. And we had Norman Lear, who did the opposite, a lifetime of creating comedy that gave us over a half century of laughter, and whose point was to create joy and provoke understanding and feelings of commonality. And we had just a great string of shows, for a change. Now, Peter, I don't think we'd ever put more than 2 good shows back to back before this, but maybe you should take a 5-week break, every year with your boys.
An unprecedented run of perfect shows. I can't believe it.
Yeah, I mean, barely ever a good show, and this was 5 in a row.
Truly amazing.
And so, again, I think maybe you and your boys should take a trip across the country every year.
Great. I'll see you in another month and a half.
But you had a great time, huh?
We did, man. We had the best time. This is an unbelievably beautiful country.
Well, I think that's a great thing for you and your boys to do, and do it every year. This week, a new show, and normally I'd say after a run of great shows that we were due for one of our many turkeys. But no, because Laurie, Garrett, and Andy Slavitt are with us to tell us where we are at this point in this pandemic. A perfectly timed show with 2 perfect guests, and this is their 3rd time together on the podcast, and they always do an amazing job of not just explaining where we are, but Laurie, a Pulitzer Prize winner in explanatory journalism, that's a thing. There's a Pulitzer Prize in explanatory journalism. She won a Pulitzer in the category of explaining stuff. So she will explain some stuff about the virus, about where we are in this pandemic. And she always takes us deeper into it in the clearest way of anyone I've ever heard. And joining Laurie is Andy Slavitt, one of, I guess, our most frequent guests, if not the most, who was head of Medicare and Medicaid under Obama and senior advisor to President Biden on COVID. I think he's tied for the most frequent guest on the Al Franken podcast, and who can tell us where we are as a country and in the world with this damn thing. It's a great show. You'll really enjoy it, for a change. By the way, we recorded it earlier in the week, just before the announcement that Americans will be able to get boosters 8 months after they had their second Pfizer or Moderna shot, and I guess 8 after their one Johnson & Johnson. But we did talk about boosters, and they're remarkable. This is a remarkable podcast, and that's why I'm remarking on it. I'm going to go right to it. There's plenty of other stuff to talk about, voting rights, Afghanistan. Certainly we will get to that inevitable tragedy in the very near future. But for today, where we are on the COVID-19 crisis in August 21, it's a great one, for a change. Thank you both. Thank you both, first of all. I love having you both on. I just want to ask you where we are right now. And I think everybody kind of wants to know that. We aren't where we were, a month ago or 2 months ago. And so where are we? Where are we? Laurie first. Laurie, where are we?
The most striking things that I've noticed of late are, first of all, in a single week, the first week of August, we saw a 7-fold increase in pediatric cases of COVID, with a soaring rate of pediatric admissions. And in many parts of the South, particularly in Texas, pediatric ICUs are now full of COVID children. And as we look across the country, we're seeing, I think, just about every single jurisdiction in the nation is seeing an increase now in COVID. It's just a question of how dramatic the increase may be. And that varies, with 8 states representing 51% of the nation's caseload right now.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that those 8 states don't have 51% of the population.
Far from it. And they, no surprise, are Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, Nevada, and Texas. But, I also think we're kind of at a danger point here with liberals, which is, not a group you usually consider dangerous. But I am seeing a really radical increase in antipathy towards the unvaccinated, in a kind of judgmentalism that says, fill in the blank, pastor so-and-so told his congregation not to get vaccinated and he's now in an ICU. And this is greeted with kind of snarky, serves him right, sort of self-righteous response, which is really terrible. And I think the degree to which we've been divided as a nation on everything else is resonating now on the whole question of masking our children for school next week or whenever your school's open, and vaccination or the lack thereof, or the right to refuse. And I'm not sure what possible tactic, short of mandates, remains in the White House quill at this point, because as far as I could tell, this administration has tried every single possible method of convincing people to get vaccinated. Yet we continue to have this very hardcore, roughly 20% of America that says, ain't going to do it. And I'm not sure what gets us past that. And the longer that is there, engendering an ecology that is conducive to emergence of Delta Plus and whatever's going to come after Delta, on and on down the Greek alphabet of variant forms of virus. What worries me is that the antipathy and the rage from the other side is rising, so that we really could be in just a horribly difficult situation. I mean, I even just think about it right here in New York City. You look at our data, and the difference between neighborhoods by zip code in terms of vaccination rate and COVID rate is very dramatic. With, in the case of New York City, where I live, Staten Island, which is traditionally the Republican voting part of the city, heavily populated by police officers and firefighters, has the lowest vaccination rate in the city and the highest COVID rate in the city, and a total refusal to abide by mask and vaccination regulations. And in contrast, you can actually see more than a 10-fold differential in both COVID rates and concurrent vaccination rates, or lack thereof, across zip code by zip code across the city. And I think that's a tale that's told nationwide, and I don't know where we go from here.
And Andy, I assume you're still very much in touch with the White House. Laurie brought up the what does the White House, what can they do?
Let's just talk about where we came from. To go back to your original question, 2020 to 2021. So 2020, it started raining, and we didn't have an umbrella. So if you went outside, you got wet, you got infected. The rain kind of was intermittent throughout the course of the year, but a lot of people got hurt. 2 things changed in 2021 in this analogy. One is we invented the umbrella. That meant that a lot of people's lives were saved. 200,000 people's lives have been saved, according to a study by Yale, just because the acceleration of the vaccine rollout. Millions of lives have been saved because of the vaccines, but 200,000 just because of the acceleration. The other thing that happened, though, and it started happening in the middle of the year, is the rain started getting harder. It started becoming a storm where you get that kind of slanty rain that the umbrella keeps most of it off of you, but not all of it. And I think just in terms of where we are, we should understand that when we ask people to wear masks, what we're saying is not that the umbrellas don't work. They work great. But you might want to also put on a rain jacket and some rain boots, would be a mask and some other precautions, because it's pretty aggressive out there. It's two to three times as aggressive with Delta. The other thing I want to just speak to where Laurie, I'm pointing us, which is the state of the debate or the state of the conversation in this country, because ultimately our ability to get out of this depends on our ability to solve our own problems. And we're all interdependent here. I mean, this isn't something where a few brave men and women can save us all. This is something where, we're going to press our ability to talk to one another and deal with one another. And so we're going to have to be capable of having this conversation in a more measured manner. And we're all mad, angry, or tired or whatever, but that doesn't mean necessarily that everybody deserves the blame for this, because much of who we want to blame is unblameable, because it's a virus. But there is an understanding we're going to have to develop, which is that this virus is likely to continue to evolve in ways that mean it's going to be here a long time. How long? Well, we're still dealing with, as Laurie could point out to you, we're still dealing with mutations from the 1918 flu, and it's 103 years later. So we have to basically understand that we're going to have to make some adaptations, but between those adaptations and science and our ability to work together, we can come out on top.
Let me ask you both about the vaccine and what it protects and what it doesn't. Andy, you said that you were in a hospital yesterday and that the nurse told you that 100% of the people in the COVID ward were not vaccinated. And we'll do the analogy of the umbrella. To what extent does the vaccine protect you from ending up in the hospital?
My background is actually immunology. And so you've kind of hit my sweet spot. And there's a lot of misinformation and confusion out there about these breakthrough infections and what they constitute, what they say about the vaccines. And, I actually see it very differently from how most of the conversation has proceeded. And that is, I think it means the vaccines are working. Because here's the deal. If you're like me, you ran off to get vaccinated the minute it was legally allowed that you could personally receive. So I got my vaccinations in January, second dose, early February. And if you just do the math, we're now out enough months that if everything worked properly, I went through a period where my body was full of neutralizing antibodies, just surging through my bloodstream, ready to pounce if they saw the SARS-CoV-2 virus in any form, any variant type, ready to jump on it. But of course, with time, what happens when it doesn't see virus is it retreats into the B cell memory compartment, which is where you want it to be, because that's where your measles protection is from a shot you got decades ago. And if you get exposed to measles, it'll come out of that memory compartment and make those neutralizing antibodies and kill off the measles. Hooray. But the problem that we're seeing with Delta, and the reason we have these so-called breakthrough cases, which are not, for the most part, overwhelmingly are not hospitalized, is that it takes time to generate a large concentration of neutralizing antibodies in your bloodstream when they're in the memory compartment, when it requires essentially turning the factory on and manufacturing the antibodies. And so the problem with the Delta variant is that its incubation time is very, very short, far shorter than routine forms of SARS-CoV-2. And so you're looking at incubation time of 3 to 5 days versus an incubation time of 7 to 10 days. And that 3 to 5 day window is too short to pull a really profound response out of your B cell memory compartment. And so what this means is that people that are fully vaccinated, like myself, could be exposed to Delta variant forms of the virus and actually get a mild illness or an infection. But once my memory compartment kicks in and starts cranking those viruses out, boom, I'm protected. I'm not ending up in a hospital, and I'm surely not ending up in an ICU or a ventilator or a grave. And so I think it's really important to understand this whole issue of the B cell memory component because, and unfortunately, the government folks haven't really talked about it this way. And so people think it means the vaccine is failing. And that is, it couldn't be further from the truth. It's quite the opposite.
This begs the question of the booster or a booster. I know that there's a booster now for people who are immunocompromised. Is that a correct
Yes.
technical term? Now, I have hay fever. Does that count? I mean, can I get the
No.
booster? No. Oh, damn.
Because hay fever is the opposite. You have an overactive immune system. It's reacting against things that it ought to be just relaxed about.
Okay, what
like
can I
your
say
average
I have to get the booster?
You should never get a shot because you have hay fever.
Well, let me ask you about the booster and when will that be widely available to people who aren't immunocompromised, and so that they're not back in the B cell memory compound, the antibodies?
I'm guessing Laurie's going to agree with me on this, but a mistake that I think we all made and we all own collectively, and then Laurie points it out, is the problems with us being too imprecise in our language. So we told people you're 95% protected, but we didn't say you're 95% protected from what? Most people don't understand the difference between SARS-CoV-2, the virus, and COVID-19, the illness. And when we tell people that they're not going to get sick, they think that means that they're not going to get the virus in their bodies. But the truth is, as Laurie points out, the fight doesn't exist outside our bodies. It's not like a shield or a sunscreen. It exists in our cells, where our immune system is programmed to have this fight. So likewise, boosters, it's another term that I think is getting thrown around and imprecise. Is it a booster if you have an insufficient immune system and you need 3 doses instead of 2? A lot of people are arguing that's not really a booster. Is it a booster if you need an annual shot? Or is a boost just taking your first shot and boosting it with a second shot? So, I mean, now's a weird time to start to become a stickler for words here, but I realize we're failing to educate the public in an intelligent way, and people are smart enough to understand it if we just talk using the right words, and I know that I haven't always done that. Now, to answer your question, after being pedantic as hell for 2 minutes, is I think we will see that people who are over 65, my prediction, will very likely not go into the late fall and winter without having received a third shot. And I think we'll start with people who work in healthcare settings and people in nursing homes. But I think we will, as they're doing in Israel, they started by making it available to people over 60. They've since moved to over 50. I don't know if we'll end up going that far, but we'll end up, and this is where I'd love Laurie's opinion. You've got Pfizer saying, yes, because of the fact that Delta acts so quickly and your immune response has fallen off from your antibody titer levels, you do need a booster shot to protect you. And then you have others saying, no, hey, wait a minute. If you're really, all you care about is hospitalizations, you shouldn't care. And then there's people who say, but if you want to protect long COVID, you might need one. So I think this is a multi-sided debate, and I'm curious where, Laurie, you come out on it.
Well, you've touched on a whole lot of things here, and they're all really important. So let me say this. I think in a past podcast with you, Al, we did talk about the famous Salk versus Sabin polio fight. And just in a brief recap, because it's so vital to what we're talking about right now. Salk invented the first polio vaccine, And his goal was to prevent children from being paralyzed and dying from that virus. And so he invented a form of the vaccine that you would inject. The problem was that the kids could still harbor virus in their intestines and pass it via fecal transmission to the outside world. And so there continued to be the famous swimming pool polio, the cases that were in the environment. Sabin came along and said, well, the only solution is an oral vaccine that literally sterilizes the virus out of your intestines so that you're not only not going to get sick yourself, but you're not a transmitter. You're not spreading the disease anymore.
Well, that begs a question that I have, which is, okay, let's say it crosses over to you, or is that the term that that you've been vaccinated? That now you're getting you get the virus, not the disease. Can you give it to your grandchildren?
So let me take you there because it's a really crucial question that we're all facing right now with COVID, which is, all right, so I'm fully vaccinated. Can I be a carrier? Is it possible for me to harbor virus that's harmless to me, but that I can pass to others? And is it possible that I can still get infected? It can still be in, say, my mouth or my nose, and I could then exhale it onto other people and never have any symptoms of any kind. And it turns out that that is possible. We don't have any idea how common, but it is possible, and that some of the epidemiology of what we're seeing in the United States really can only be explained by understanding that there are asymptomatic vaccinated carriers. And really, that's why we come back to we still need the mask. So it's possible that this virus can be residing in your nose and in your mouth because the kind of specific antibodies, the class of antibodies that is most effective in killing the virus are not really in your nose. They're elsewhere in your body. Your nose has a different kind of immune response. And there are now studies that show, and some of them have come, as Andy mentioned, out of Israel, that show that vaccinated people can indeed have virus in their nose. So we all have a duty to wear a mask, including the vaccinated, because we don't want to run the risk that we pass it to our unvaccinated grandchildren or children.
That's exactly what I want to know, because my granddaughter is having her 5th birthday on September 7th out in Los Angeles. And Franny and I are wondering, should we go? And we've talked to our daughter and we're thinking maybe we should not.
Well, wear a mask. I don't think people need to keep making these choices as binary, like I will see them or I won't see them. If you're vaccinated, you're safe. You just want to make sure you're not a carrier, so wear a mask. It's a simple issue.
Laurie, I want to say something which I want you to just correct me if I'm wrong, because you know more firsthand and mine's more secondhand. But some of the thinking from a lot of scientists, this doesn't change the advice, by the way, about the mask, but just to make it clear that you're less likely to get it if you're vaccinated. So that automatically obviously means you're less likely to spread it. And B, because of the way Laurie described the immune response, there is a short period of time when the virus is in your nose, but it's not as long. And so when you're in a situation like Provincetown, where you've got a bunch of people in a club dancing indoors around one another, it spreads quite easily from one person to another. But I don't think that necessarily means it spreads anywhere close to as easily as with unvaccinated people. And Laurie, check me if I got any of that wrong.
No, I think you're basically right. And then that takes us back to the question that Al asked us about, what about a third booster? And so the real dilemma here, which I tried to address in my most recent foreign policy piece, is that how do we balance what's best for the average American against what's best for the rest of the world? There's only so much vaccine being manufactured. And it's not just even a question of the amount of vaccine, it's all the raw ingredients, everything that goes into making these vaccines, regardless of which type of vaccine we're talking about. There are shortages across the board, rate limiting steps, many of them, that are impeding our ability to make billions of doses. So if Americans go for a third dose, does that mean it's that much longer before Zambians, Thais, folks in, Paraguay get their full doses of vaccine? When you look at the African continent, I think it's still less than 2% of the population has seen a single dose. So there's a real justice issue here. There's another aspect, though, to that justice equation, and that is if in the absence of a third booster, some segment of the population can serve as walking petri dishes, being infected, perhaps asymptomatic to them, but harboring virus that can mutate in them, leading to yet the next, Greek alphabet ascribed variant strain. What are we doing for the rest of the world? Maybe on the one hand, we're lowering the amount of supply of vaccine for the rest of the world. But on the other hand, maybe by the time the vaccine is available, everything will have mutated thanks to our under-vaccination as Americans, and we will have supplied the world with a more heinous strain.
The Delta variant, where did that come from? I mean, in other words, that danger isn't necessarily just us developing a new variant. It's if the rest of the world isn't vaccinated, then those variants have the opportunity to mutate more and more overseas, right? And then that comes here.
The global conversation right now is the G7 is saying it's going to take us through the end of 2022 to vaccinate about 70% of the globe. And that's just too long. Because what the virus does is it's under attack by these vaccines, and so it adapts. So if you attack it really slowly, all you're doing is giving it time to adapt. But if you attack it quickly, you're much better off. So something like having 70% of the globe vaccinated by March of 2022 is a lot better and feels like a lot better target. But that's going to require us doing things across the globe that is operating differently. That means the G20 coming together with all the world bodies and acting in a highly coordinated fashion. It can be done, but it can't be done the way we're doing things today.
Right.
What are we doing today that the G20 doesn't? What exactly are we not doing?
Well, for one, there's the difference between the G7 and the G20.
Right.
We view this as a global competition with China and Russia. We'll never get it done. And if we view all of the world's vaccine supply is at play and concentrate on the places in the globe that need to get vaccinated and prioritize, we have myriad of issues from regulatory, export, import, competing over supply chain, which Laurie actually previously mentioned, regulations, to everything else. It's not about money. The IMF is on board, others are on board, but we need everybody to come together and say, okay, we need effectively 11 billion doses to go out and into arms. And that is a massive effort. And it needs to be coordinated across the G20, not just the G7.
In Ebola, we led a global effort, right? And instead, Trump gave it to the states. I mean, and in your book, you write that they deliberately did that so that when and if it failed, he could blame the state.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's an analogy here, exactly as you say, which is if you atomize it, ATOM, not ADAM, but if you atomize it so that you keep dividing the effort, you're going to suboptimize, and we just don't have the time for that. Seeing this setback in Afghanistan is actually highly, highly, highly related to what we're dealing with here because, we have to be able to operate not as protectionists, not with our own interests, but globally with world leadership. And if you ask anybody around the world, where does that leadership have to come from? Everybody says the same thing. It has to come from the United States. Merkel's leaving the stage. We've had Brexit. Europe is weaker. The United States has to lead that, and the United States has to do that in a way with real diplomacy with China and Russia. And that's just That's where we are. COVID-19 is now a geopolitical issue because I think those 9 months make all the difference.
What's really interesting, Andy, is that when this whole mess started back in January, February 2020, everybody noticed right away that when China went into lockdown, the CO2 level dropped, the air pollution levels dropped, and there suddenly was this sense of linkage that we were seeing a lesson somehow about climate change through our pandemic lens. Well, we fast forward now, we just had the IPCC report released, which is just devastating.
Devastating.
And it has told us that the situation is far, far, far further along. And in fact, not in our lifetime, our children's lifetime, our great children, great, great, will CO2 be restored to pre-industrial levels, even if we stopped right now. And so that's all rather sobering. But what really turns out to be the big lesson that everybody is learning, looking at the comparison of the climate situation and the COVID situation, is that global governance matters, and we don't have it. We lack a real capacity to have a shared sense of sacrifice, a shared sense of legal obligation, and a shared sense of the goods, the good side, the upside. So, I guess the analogy would be here in the United States, we're talking about a third dose possibly of vaccine when so many in the world have never seen a first dose. Similarly, here in the United States, the hottest stock trades are all the electric vehicle related products and cars, whether it's Tesla or a Ford battery or whatever it may be. But do you think any of those electric vehicles are going to make their way into the streets of Lusaka and Vientiane anytime soon? Probably not. And so we're I think very similar tracks of difficulty, whether it's G20, G7, UN, whatever tier of global governance you want to look at. And we're in the same problem of nation first, global second.
Well, let me make a political point and toss this to you, Al, because I think what Laurie's saying, first of all, completely right and very profound if you think about the implications. It says a lot about the limitations of this strategy that some political parties have had here in the United States of liberty at all costs and putting down global institutions and putting our interests first and abandoning global leadership as not just sort of principles. And look, you could argue correctly that we've never been good at living up to the principles beyond that. But it's now more than that. It's now a necessity. And we may feel it last because we're wealthier, but we are feeling it. And I think the point that makes this sharper is we're no longer arguing about will climate change hurt us in the future, but this summer, everybody knows the climate change is hurting us now. And so our inability to deal with things like COVID, which may have just be the warning sign for us for the planet, is just that's where the game is going to have to be played.
And just to further bring them together, there's 2 new studies that show a link between COVID and climate change directly, in the sense that wherever people are breathing the fumes from burning wildfires, their lungs are less capable of withstanding COVID infection, and the mortality rates are higher.
When you brought that up about certain political parties, and the thing I just flashed back to is there was a resolution that we needed 2/3 for, I believe, to adopt some UN, some regulation, a worldwide regulation about creating curbs for handicapped people, right? For people who needed, so that if you traveled around the world, they had the same standards that basically we did. And Bob Dole came to the floor in a wheelchair. It didn't pass because the Republicans didn't want to give the UN that power. And I was appalled and shocked. And so much of this is this political ideology and the getting reelected and not losing the primary in Oklahoma, not losing the primary in Texas, not losing the primary in Louisiana and Arkansas. And it's really ugly, and we have real isolationists like Rand Paul. It drives me nuts.
There's an ideology here, which is, human nature to some extent is the me before the we. So you need leaders who can sell the we and define the we broadly and appropriately. And if you are at a time of fear, at a time when you fear for yours or your family not getting yours, the politics of fear and resentment work really, really, really well. It's really, really easy. It's harder for you to do what you did, Al, which is go out and appeal to people's decency than the people you tended to run against, who were out there appealing to people's kind of carnal interests.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about getting this 70% of the world inoculated. We don't have 70% of this country, do we?
No. And what we're seeing is that general inoculations are going down for kids as well, partly because people were less likely to pay doctor visits during the COVID lockdowns, and partly because the anti-vaccine sentiments are resonating larger than just talking about COVID. And we're seeing a kind of bizarre alliance forming between the likes of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his sort of organic foods inspired opposition to vaccines, sort of, what is the healthiest kind of Marin County hello kind of approach, and the Proud Boys and the evangelical right wing, forming this bizarre alliance that now today there is a cardinal in Wisconsin who's fighting for his life on a ventilator. That cardinal had specifically named the COVID vaccine as a source of evil and told his Catholic followers that they should never agree to be vaccinated. He had opposed most aspects of the Biden administration's fight to tackle COVID. But of course, he acquired the disease himself and is now in critical condition. And back to what I said earlier, I tweeted about this and some liberals responded snidely, it serves him right, and this and that about the Catholic Church. And that's not the correct response. The correct response is, how can we overcome these seemingly intransigent misunderstandings, misbeliefs, dogmatically driven, opposition to essential public health? The other thing to talk about is that across the nation, people who are practitioners of public health are quitting the profession because they've been attacked so viciously. They've been threatened, their lives threatened. They've seen their pay cut by governments that don't like to restrict people's ability to walk around without a mask and so on. And we're seeing them attacked. It's the messenger being attacked for trying to get you to save your life.
Laurie, I just got to push back on one thing you said.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know the percentage of Marin County residents that are vaccinated?
I don't know the latest. I just know historically they were
94%. 94%.
Oh, really?
I was kind of
okay.
going to say that because Marin County is a very affluent.
It's tempting to create this false equivalence. And I totally agree with you about the snarkiness and that people get what they deserve. But it is by and large not the case that, except for some really gross examples, that people on the left are not getting vaccinated.
Oh, but I was referring to Marin because historically,
Yeah,
for
I know.
measles
No, but I think
vaccination,
that's a bit of a
all of that, they were among the worst, as like Vashon Island off of Seattle.
yeah. They're a bit, but
They
it's a bit
had
of a
the
meme.
highest.
It's a bit of a meme, and I just want to. I don't live in Marin County, so I'm not defending anybody that I know. But I'm telling you, it's one of the highest vaccinated counties in the country when it comes to COVID.
That's great. I'm really happy to hear that.
But yeah, how do we approach this? What is the information approach? What is the propaganda? How do we get people who will not get vaccinated? How do we get them to accept
Laurie said it
that?
earlier. Let's go back to it. Let's talk about it. And it's vaccine requirements. Very simply speaking, there's people who are vaccinated, there's people who are unvaccinated, and there's people who can't get protection because they're either immunocompromised or because they're under 12. And all you're saying when you're saying you're going to require people to be vaccinated to go to work, go to college, enter a sports arena, or enter a bar, is that the third group matters too. And if people who always say, I don't want to get vaccinated or I don't want to get regular testing to show that I'm negative, fine. You don't have to go to the bar. You don't have to go to this particular office space. You don't have to go to this particular place. But for employers and schools and venues and localities to say, hey, demonstrate you're vaccinated or show us a negative test or don't come in is a very reasonable thing to do. And I think it's going to be commonplace. There's 25 million Americans who say that if they needed to get vaccinated in order to go to work or to go to hang out in crowds, they would get vaccinated without objection. That would take us from 72% to about 80%. I won't say overnight, but relatively speaking, in one fell swoop. So that's where I've been spending my energy and attention, is on getting employers and others to take collective action, like Walmart has, like Google has, like Tyson's Foods has, to essentially say, sorry, if you want to be here, you need to keep this place safe.
Amen.
Amen. Okay, we solved that, or at least. Phew. Yeah, I'm going on tour, which I'm a little nervous about. But we're requiring people to be vaccinated, to enter the theater.
That is great.
Yeah.
That is great.
Well, or if you're not vaccinated, we will vaccinate you and put you in a plexiglass booth in the back row of the balcony.
Also good. I mean, look,
they'll enjoy the show.
It is. There are loud voices. Yes, this has to be done respectfully. Yes, we have to respect people's individual rights, of course, but it is not controversial. I mean, it is controversial in some parts, but there is a consensus, a broad consensus, that there is a role for vaccine requirements, and there is a limitation, as we're learning, to individual liberties, or left to our own devices, we'll all just basically sit home, emit carbons, and spread COVID.
It is true that obviously, if you're not vaccinated, and the more people that aren't vaccinated, the more people that will get infected, and the more chance the virus has to mutate, and that is really dangerous for everybody here and everybody on the planet. So there.
What all this is reminding me of is, have you guys ever heard of a early 20th century writer American named Paul Decouef?
No.
He was a staff writer for the New Yorker back in the 1920s, and he wrote a book that became a huge seller called Microbes and Man. And it was,
no wonder you know this book.
Yes, it was early days of understanding germ theory, but he was basically saying, it's now within our power to not have children die of preventable diseases. We understand what they are now. We can conquer them. And he, made a hero out of the leadership of the Rockefeller University back in the day. So he totally believed all of this was possible. And then as we went into the Great Depression, he saw that even when vaccines were invented, even when there was a diphtheria antitoxin that could save children's lives before there was a vaccine, that things weren't implemented except for the wealthier kids. and that for poor children, particularly those that were immigrants living in the tenements across the northeastern cities, the solutions were not available. And he became deeply cynical and wrote a book that was sarcastically titled, "Why Keep Them Alive?" But we are constantly fighting those two sides of the exact same problem over and over and over again. We have a technology, we have the capacity to control disease, and yet it's not equitably distributed, or it's actively resisted by, a subset of the population. And we end up with the "why keep them alive" question.
Well, I mean, the populations that aren't getting vaccinated, let me ask you about this. We've had historically the Tuskegee experiment keeps getting referred to. What are the percentages in Black communities?
Well, the numbers are terrible. I don't know what today's latest figures are, but African Americans are the least likely to be fully vaccinated and the most likely, as a percentage of their population on a per 100,000 population basis, the most likely to be hospitalized and to die of COVID. It's a terrible equation. And Andy should talk about this, but there have been a lot of really innovative efforts in this administration to try and reach key leaders within the African American community, whether they're religious or pop stars or whatever role they play, sports stars, to try and get change in the perspective. But boy, we're confronting decades and 200 plus years of reason for distrust of government and distrust of the healthcare system in that community.
COVID is kind of an occupational disease, less so as it gets more contagious. But for people who work hourly jobs or salary jobs are much more exposed. The principal reason why we think people of color have been dying in greater numbers, they've not been able to isolate quite as easily as a group and as a whole, as opposed to something about people's genetic makeup or anything like that. And then you add to that people of color have not just from Tuskegee, but day in and day out have a broader set of reasons to distrust the medical system and have been abused by the medical system and don't have access to the medical system. And then there's a couple phenomena that other people who either study it more closely or live in the African American community could describe better than I could, which is that there are some cultural things that are causing young males to push back against getting vaccinated. That is a real problem and a real challenge, that it's not macho to get vaccinated and things of that nature that are developing. And then, of course, everybody, every community is subject to misinformation. Black communities, no exception. The White House has an Office of Health Equity. It's the first Office of Health Equity ever come out of a White House. It's led by some remarkable people. It's got a remarkable group of participants. They are daily in contact on the ground with people in the communities, trying to listen and understand how to solve these problems. You can't solve them if you don't understand them, and they have to all be solved locally with people that are trusted in the local community. It's more ground game than it is anything else, but it's really hard because, like everything else with COVID that's not working, we're trying to undo decades, if not generations, of challenges in one fell swoop.
I saw an ad, and I don't know if this was in Minnesota or it was nationwide, but it was an ad where it was a young girl, maybe 16, 17, and she was Black and talking to a doctor who was Black. And she says, "I heard that this could make you infertile." And he answered her question saying, no, but he did it. It was done in such a way that is exactly what Laurie was talking about, which is not judgmental in the slightest, just giving her information and really respecting her and respecting the fact that people are getting misinformation and that you can respect people who've gotten misinformation and draw wrong conclusions and just inform them without, this showed tremendous respect for people who are just getting bad information. I think that's really important.
I don't think we get out of this catastrophe either as a nation or as a world population, if we can't figure out how to actually care about the survival of another human being and to concretely understand that our actions affect the livelihood of another individual, whether that's, you know, switching from a fossil fuel burning vehicle to an EV to reduce our CO2 footprint, or it's wearing a mask, such a tremendous inconvenience putting a mask on in order to enter a supermarket, or showing respect for the waiter who comes to your table and has to wear a mask, is required in his job to do so, but may not be really adequately protected if you're not vaccinated. So we have to figure out a way. You know, I keep feeling like whatever happened to the days when people believed in things like the United Way, the community chest, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, all the things that were about community contribution, community action, and recognizing that your actions affected dozens or hundreds of other people and you had a responsibility. It's really striking to me that the social responsibility aspect of both mask wearing and willingness to take a vaccine often takes a back seat to a very personal argument. Do you wear a mask to protect yourself? Do you get a vaccine to protect yourself? But the real issue for me is, am I wearing a mask to protect others in case maybe despite my vaccine, I'm harboring virus unknowingly in my nose? And do I get vaccinated so that I'm protecting everybody around me, not just myself?
You know, when you say what happened was Rush Limbaugh. What happened was Fox News. What happened is social media. What happened are people who are exploiting those things. And that's why it's hard not to be mad at some people.
I hear the Beatles singing in my head, all you need is love. Wah, 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 wah.
I know
I
the
think,
song, Laurie.
but it was so sweet.
Yeah.
And you look back and it seems so, gosh, isn't that just so hokey? Well, whatever happened to that? It's gone.
Can you do that again, Laurie? Look, if the world, you know how the all of the sci-fi movies show the world ending with some major catastrophe, and then there's a small team of brilliant people that are there to save the world. If the chips were down and we had to spend our way out of the problem with a small group of talented people, I'd have a lot of confidence in our ability to do it. But if you said to us, instead of having a hard problem that a small number of people have to solve, we had an easy problem that we had to unify on, I'd I'd rather take the first bet than the second bet. I don't like our odds.
Well, just look at how we became so enamored with the idea of the benevolent billionaire. You know, the Bill Gates or the whatever.
Or the Donald Trumps. I mean, yeah.
Who's going to come in and drop, $100 million on this problem and $100 million on that problem? And isn't that just going to take care of everything? No, we should have had them taxed like crazy. It should have gone through a democratic process. There should be buy-in that we all believe in and where we all share in the problem solving. And it shouldn't be like it is now, where there are health departments all over America and schools of public health all over America that are on tenterhooks wondering what the divorce between Bill and Melinda Gates will mean for their survival. That's ridiculous. And the whole idea that we're waiting for the billionaire Superman, forget about it.
Let me get a little political here, and I'm just going to bring up Trump. Okay, Trump got vaccinated. He could have gotten vaccinated on television. He could have gotten vaccinated on television and said, everybody get vaccinated. He could have done that. He could still do that. He can do that any day. He can do that tomorrow. He can do that the day after tomorrow. He can do that. Donald Trump wants Joe Biden to fail. And I think in Donald Trump's mind, the more people who die under Joe Biden, the better it is for him. Now, that's a hard thing to say about someone, but this guy is the biggest lowlife.
Maybe it's true, but I don't think it's the central point any longer.
Well, it is. I'll tell you why I think it is. Because my former colleagues who know who Trump is are afraid of him, and they're afraid to abandon him. And so they don't publicly say the election wasn't stolen. So they add to this division. They allow it to happen.
Yeah, but look, he's a spokesperson for 25% of this country that wants to go back to a day when if you're black or you're female, you could be seen but not heard. And that group's always existed. He was better than anybody else at taking advantage of it. But if he dropped off the edge of the planet tomorrow, that wouldn't change enough because that group is still out there, not just in the U.S., but there's some of that group in other parts of the world. And, that attitude of get your hands off of my wealth, get your hands off of my this, get your hands off of my liberty, get your hands off my gun, get your hands off my all that is going to have a very obvious conclusion to it. He was no genius. He just played the circus. And my point is just we all probably agree on that about Trump. But this issue is out there, and we're going to have to deal with it long after he's gone.
I know, but he was the president of the United States, and he did everything he could to divide people, everything he could, and continues to do, and continues to be supported by 75, 80, 85% of the Republican Party. And that's why every Republican politician, look at the House, look at the Senate. They're afraid to say anything counter to the stuff he's claiming. And that is just damaging to no end. And I think that's part of this.
If you ran for office in 2024, if the race were right now, could any of us say with confidence that he wouldn't win? Is there enough political support in this country that we could be worried that he could win if he ran against Joe Biden again today? And if the answer is yes, then I think the problem is both Trump and much deeper than Trump.
When he said, I like people who weren't captured, I said, okay, that's the end of his campaign. He just said that a POW, he didn't like John McCain because he was captured. And I went, okay, that's the end of him. There's no counting this guy out, I guess. But I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
I think there's a large part of our country that feels pretty strongly and without much objection to all the things he says. So my point is not that Trump's not a problem, but my point is that he captures the problem. He puts a name to a problem that we have in this country.
Okay, but what are the numbers on vaccination by party? Laurie, do you know that?
Oh, well, it is a striking difference. Overwhelmingly, Democrats are vaccinated, favor vaccination, and they're much more likely to support the idea that there should be some mandates associated with vaccination, especially for employment and for schools. And in contrast, Republicans are far less likely to be vaccinated, to support masks, and so on. So everything has indeed divided, red and blue. But I don't think we gain a lot by finding ourselves just endlessly mired in that repeating cycle of debate. It's almost like ceding the ground to them and saying, okay, that's legitimate debate. Let's talk about our party platform and our position. I will say this though, if of all the things I underestimated and got wrong, and I've certainly made my share of mistakes in interpreting what was going on with this epidemic over the last year and a half, but of all the things I got wrong, the one I really didn't see coming was that it would become a matter of party platform for one party to oppose universal masking, to oppose vaccination mandates, to oppose most of the standard armamentarium of public health. And that I really didn't see coming. That shocked me. And I don't think that you can blame it all on Trump, because frankly, the worst of it's happening now in his absence, when he's no longer in power. And a lot of it has to do with, the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the earth and the Rand Pauls of the earth, but also their grassroots. It's shocking to me when I see parents out at PTA meetings saying, I want my child to breathe, don't put a mask on them. And all the school board's trying to do is save your child's life. It's an amazing situation we've ended up in, but I don't really think you can put it all at the feet of Trump. Trump was enabled, and there's a lot that's gone on post-Trump that's not his doing.
Someone on his staff should have gone right at the beginning, going like, Mr. President, we've made you the finest mask. It's made of silk, the finest silk ever made. And look at the embroidery here, the seal of the United States. Look at the talons of the eagle holding the arrows are made of 24 karat gold. No one has a mask like this. This mask surgery is the most powerful man in the world. And the scent, Ivanka's hair.
Oh man.
That would have saved some lives. I mean, there's a lot on him.
These guys are populists. They play to the crowd. He takes the temperature of how people are feeling. And if people are feeling racist or isolationist, or if they're feeling anti-science, that's why he adopts those positions, not because he believes those things. So that sentiment is,
I think he's racist.
Fans the claims. But that sentiment is sadly very resonant in large part of the population.
I know.
I mean, those people that rode their motorcycles to Sturgis and are there now in this massive, what are the numbers? 200,000 people?
Yeah.
Not wearing masks, many of them proudly not vaccinated, gathered in this motorcycle rally. Well, I don't think that they are necessarily inspired by anything any particular politician said.
Totally agree.
They've absorbed an entire gestalt here. They've become part of a universe that sees the world in a very specific way. And part of that world is opposition to anything that smacks of government telling you have to do something, unless it's government telling those other people that they have to do something. But just don't try to tell me. Don't tell white folks what to do. Don't tell the folks that came out of the era of privilege that they have to follow any orders. And I don't really think that that's specific to Trump. I think he capitalized on it, but it wasn't his idea. It existed long before he was on the political scene, and it'll exist long after he's off the political scene.
No, but I mean, he could have easily just said, get the vaccine, and we wouldn't exactly be here right now.
It's actually at these tough moments that you really need to reflect on the optimism of things that we have. We have all the tools. This mRNA platform is dynamite. Even if the virus mutates, the platform can continue to keep up with it and stay ahead of it. So much of what we have in our lives will not be uprooted by this. This will become a manageable challenge for most of us. We have to be good people. We have to recognize that there are people who are not so easily protected, and we have to look out for them. And some of those people exist in this country, and some are people around the globe. But we have the capabilities now. I mean, we have the umbrella, we have the rain jacket, we have it all. And we all can protect ourselves. The question we need to ask ourselves is, are we willing to protect one another? And if we are, I like where we'll end up.
When are kids going to be able to get the shot?
Well, kids under 5 to 12, it's going to be some months yet.
The FDA is saying probably early 2022. We'll see if they can push that up. Obviously, the safety concerns with children uh, run a long list that are different from the concerns for adults. So there are different things you need to look for. You have to remember there are a lot of drugs that act quite differently in the body of a child versus the body of an adult. And of course, Ritalin is the classic one where it's exactly opposite effect, child versus an adult. So we need to be very careful and be sure that we're looking at the right parameters to determine the health of a child. And I just remind everybody, Andy just said how great the mRNA platforms have turned out to be, which is true. I mean, really exciting. And soon coming our way will be mRNA platform vaccines relevant to a whole host of other diseases, including various types of cancer. And so, we are on this amazing trajectory with the mRNA platform. But we also need to, recall that we didn't really know when all of this started what to test for. And we still don't really have an agreement on what are the so-called correlates of immunity. What specifically do we measure to say you are immune to this disease or you are capable of fighting off this disease? What proves that in the individual? We approved based on lowered hospitalization rates and lowered death rates, which was that 95% figure, 98%, depending on which vaccine you're talking about. Now, we're going to want to come up with something that proves that it stops infection in children. I think that's going to be a very high bar. It's a different bar.
Thank you, guys. Thank you both.
We're good to do this again.
We should do it periodically. I mean, I know until it goes away.
Okay? Which it's not going to do.
That's what I meant. So
there's very few people who know more than Laurie. So it's awesome to be just listening to you.
Oh, God. You're the one that was in the government.
and everyone knows that anyone in the government really knows an incredible amount.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. Just really, I can't tell you how much I value these. So stay safe.
Thanks, Al.
Thank you, Laurie. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, guys.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening. That beautiful music is by Leo Kottke, the great Leo Kottke. I want to thank Peter Ogburn for producing this podcast. We'll talk again next week.